The morning I drove toward my grandfather's property, I expected to spend a quiet weekend remembering him. Instead, I saw 2 pickup trucks parked beside the old fence and several strangers walking across the land with measuring tools. They weren't admiring the view. They were working with confidence, as though the place already belonged to them. My stomach tightened before I even stepped out of my car. I hurried across the gravel driveway and called out, "Excuse me, what's going on here?" One of the workers looked up with a polite smile. "We're preparing for the property transfer," he answered. "The new owner wants everything ready before closing." His words hit me like a wave. "New owner?" I repeated, unable to hide my confusion. Before anyone could explain further, I heard familiar voices behind me. I turned around and saw my parents walking out of my grandfather's farmhouse. Both of them looked surprisingly calm, almost as if they had expected me to arrive at that exact moment. My mother forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "There you are," she said casually. "We were going to call you later." I stared at her, then back at the workers. "Call me about what?" I asked. My father folded his arms and answered without hesitation. "The property is sold. Everything's already been arranged." For a few seconds, I couldn't process what I had just heard. "Sold?" I whispered. "Grandpa left this land to me." My father sighed impatiently. "Things changed," he replied. "It was the practical decision." I looked around the property that had been part of my childhood. Every fence, every tree, and every path carried memories of weekends spent with my grandfather. He had always told me this land wasn't valuable because of money. It was valuable because it represented family history, hard work, and trust. I turned back toward my parents. "When did this happen?" I asked. My mother stepped closer and said, "The paperwork has already been handled. There isn't anything left to discuss." Her calm voice only made my confusion worse. "Handled by who?" I asked. Neither of them answered immediately. Instead, they exchanged a quick glance that made me feel like I had walked into a conversation that had started long before I arrived. My father finally spoke. "We took care of everything while you were living in Chicago. You were busy with work, and someone had to make a decision." I stared at him in disbelief. "You made a decision about my inheritance without even calling me?" He shrugged as though the answer should have been obvious. "We did what we believed was best for the family." Those words echoed in my mind. Every time someone in my family said they were doing something for the family, it usually meant someone else's opinion had been ignored. I looked back toward the workers, who had quietly returned to their measurements while pretending not to hear our conversation. The situation suddenly felt painfully real. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Plans were already moving forward. I took a slow breath and asked the question that mattered most. "Did Grandpa ever say he wanted this land sold?" My parents remained silent for a moment before my mother finally answered. "That's not important anymore." Her response immediately raised more questions than it answered. My grandfather had always been careful with every document and every promise he made. He never left important decisions to chance. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. "I'm calling whoever bought this property," I said. My father immediately stepped forward. "There's no reason for that." "There is every reason," I replied firmly. "If this land has really been sold, I deserve to know exactly what happened." Neither of my parents tried to stop me again, but their nervous expressions told me something wasn't right. They had expected me to accept their explanation without asking questions. Instead, I was about to discover the first crack in the story they had worked so hard to protect. A few minutes later, I found the buyer's contact information through the real estate sign posted near the entrance. I took one last look at my parents before pressing the call button, completely unaware that one conversation was about to reveal the secret they believed would stay buried forever. I stepped away from my parents before making the call. I didn't want them interrupting the conversation or trying to answer for someone else. My hands were steady, but my heart wasn't. Too many questions were running through my mind, and I needed facts instead of explanations. The phone rang twice before a calm male voice answered. "Hello, this is Daniel Foster." I introduced myself immediately. "My name is Claire. I'm the granddaughter of the previous owner of the property on Willow Creek Road. I was told you've purchased it." There was a brief silence before he responded politely. "Yes, that's correct. We're in the final stages of the transaction." His answer confirmed the sale was real, but something in his careful wording caught my attention. He had said, "final stages," not completed. I glanced toward my parents, who were watching me from across the yard. My father had crossed his arms again, while my mother kept looking at her phone as if she weren't paying attention. Neither of them looked relaxed anymore. "I have a question," I said. "Did you personally speak with me before agreeing to buy the property?" Daniel sounded surprised. "No. I was told your parents were handling everything on behalf of the family." I felt my stomach tighten. "They never contacted me," I replied. "The land was left to me by my grandfather." Another short silence followed. This one felt much heavier than the first. Daniel cleared his throat. I wasn't aware there had been any disagreement. His voice remained professional, but I could hear concern beginning to replace confidence. It was obvious he hadn't expected this phone call. I took a slow breath and asked the question that mattered most. "Has the sale officially closed?" I waited quietly while he checked something. I could hear papers moving in the background before he finally answered. "Not yet," he said. "Most of the paperwork has been completed, but we're still waiting for one final document before ownership can legally transfer." My heart skipped a beat. That wasn't what my parents had told me. I looked back at them. They were pretending not to watch me, but both of them had gone unusually quiet. Something told me they already knew exactly which document Daniel was talking about. "What document is missing?" I asked carefully. Daniel hesitated for a moment. "I'm not comfortable discussing every legal detail over the phone, but I can tell you one required document hasn't been provided yet." His careful answer only increased my suspicion. If one document was preventing the entire sale, then the transaction wasn't nearly as complete as my parents had claimed. The situation was starting to look very different. "I appreciate your honesty," I said. "Can I ask one more question?" Daniel answered immediately. "Of course." "If that missing document never appears," I asked, "what happens to the sale?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took another long pause before speaking. "Without it," he explained, "the transfer cannot legally be finalized. Everyone involved has been waiting for that document before moving forward." My pulse quickened. The workers, the measurements, and all the confidence my parents had shown suddenly seemed built on something unfinished. I thanked Daniel for his time. Before ending the call, he added one sentence that stayed with me. "If you're directly connected to the estate, I recommend speaking with an attorney before making any decisions." His advice sounded sincere, rather than defensive. After hanging up, I slipped my phone back into my pocket and walked toward my parents. They immediately searched my face, trying to guess what I had learned. My father spoke first. "Well?" he asked. I met his eyes calmly. "The sale isn't finished," I replied. His expression changed for just a fraction of a second, before returning to forced confidence. It was enough to tell me everything. "What are you talking about?" my mother asked quickly. I answered without raising my voice. "The buyer said one required document is still missing. Without it, the property can't legally be transferred." Neither of them responded immediately. Their silence was louder than any denial they could have offered. They had spent the entire morning acting as though everything was already decided. Yet one missing paper had stopped the entire process. I looked across the property my grandfather loved so much. For the first time since arriving, I felt something stronger than confusion. I felt hope. Whatever that missing document was, it had become the only thing standing between my parents' plan and the future my grandfather had intended. I had no idea then that I already knew exactly where that final paper was hidden. I stood quietly on my grandfather's property, letting Daniel's words settle in my mind. The sale wasn't complete. Everything depended on one missing document. As I looked across the old farmhouse, a memory suddenly returned with surprising clarity. It wasn't just a random thought. It was something my grandfather had told me years before, only a few months before he passed away. I could still picture that afternoon. We had been sitting on the wooden porch, watching the sun disappear behind the trees. He had handed me a large brown envelope and smiled in the calm way he always did whenever he wanted me to pay close attention. "Claire," he had said, "one day this envelope will matter more than you can imagine." At the time, I had laughed softly. "Grandpa, you're making it sound like a treasure map." He chuckled and shook his head. "No," he replied. "It's much more important than that. Promise me you'll keep it safe, and don't let anyone convince you to hand it over unless you fully understand why they're asking." His serious expression made me stop smiling immediately. I had promised without asking too many questions. My grandfather was careful with legal matters, and I trusted him completely. After that conversation, I stored the envelope in a fireproof lockbox inside my apartment in Chicago and never opened it. He had asked me to keep it safe, and that was exactly what I did. Standing there years later, I suddenly realized something that made my heart race. I had completely forgotten about that envelope until Daniel mentioned the missing document. The timing couldn't be a coincidence. I slowly looked toward my parents. They were speaking quietly with one of the workers, pretending everything was moving forward exactly as planned. Neither of them knew the memory that had just returned to me. I walked over to them without revealing what I was thinking. My father immediately asked, "Have you finished making calls?" His tone sounded impatient, almost nervous. "Yes," I answered calmly. "I'm heading back to Chicago this afternoon." My mother looked relieved. "Good," she said. "There's really nothing else for you to worry about." I forced a small smile even though my thoughts were racing. "Maybe," I replied. "We'll see." They seemed satisfied with that answer, believing I had accepted the situation. I didn't correct them. As I drove away from the property, I kept replaying my grandfather's exact words. "Don't let anyone convince you to hand it over unless you fully understand why they're asking." He hadn't simply asked me to store an envelope. He had given me a warning. The 4-hour drive home felt longer than usual. Every mile increased my curiosity. What exactly was inside that envelope? Why had my grandfather trusted me with it instead of leaving it with his attorney or keeping it inside his safe? When I finally reached my apartment, I barely stopped to unpack my overnight bag. I walked straight to the bedroom closet, knelt beside the shelf, and pulled out the heavy fireproof lockbox I hadn't opened in years. My hands hesitated for just a second before entering the combination. The lock clicked open, revealing important personal documents exactly where I had left them. Beneath them sat the large brown envelope with my name written across the front in my grandfather's familiar handwriting. Seeing his handwriting brought back a flood of memories. I gently traced the letters with my finger before turning the envelope over. The seal had never been broken. Whatever was inside had remained untouched since the day he handed it to me. I carefully opened the envelope and slid out several neatly folded papers. The first page contained legal language I didn't immediately recognize. Attached behind it was another signed document with official seals and notarized signatures. As I continued reading, one sentence instantly caught my attention. My breathing slowed as I read it again to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. The document clearly referred to my grandfather's property and included instructions about ownership that I had never heard anyone mention before. At that moment, I finally understood why Daniel had said the sale couldn't move forward without one missing paper. I wasn't holding just another family document. I was holding the exact piece every person involved had been searching for. I sat back in complete silence, staring at the papers in disbelief. My grandfather hadn't simply protected the land. He had protected my ability to decide its future myself. Suddenly, my parents' confidence, their secrecy, and their urgency all made perfect sense. I carefully returned every page to the envelope and placed it back inside the lockbox. This time, I wasn't protecting an old memory. I was protecting the one document that could completely change everything. My parents believed the only thing standing in their way was a missing signature. They had no idea the final paper had been safely in my possession all along, and I had absolutely no intention of handing it over until I understood every word it contained. The morning after I opened my grandfather's envelope, my phone started ringing before I had even finished my coffee. My mother's name appeared on the screen. I already had a feeling she wasn't calling just to ask how I was doing. I let the phone ring once more before answering. "Claire," she said quickly, "we need to talk about the property." Her voice sounded unusually friendly, almost rehearsed. "I've been thinking about it too," I replied calmly, careful not to reveal that I already knew far more than she expected. There was a short pause before she asked the question I had been waiting for. "Did Grandpa ever leave you any paperwork?" I looked toward the lockbox sitting quietly on the shelf across the room. "Why do you ask?" I answered, instead of giving her a direct reply. She hesitated. "We're just trying to finish the legal process. The buyer is getting impatient." I noticed she never actually answered my question. Instead, she immediately shifted the conversation back to the sale itself. "I found an envelope Grandpa gave me years ago," I admitted carefully. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted several seconds. When my mother finally spoke again, her voice sounded noticeably different. "What was inside?" she asked quickly. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked my own question. "Why didn't either of you ever mention Grandpa gave me something important before he passed away?" My mother sighed. "We probably forgot about it," she replied. The excuse sounded weak even to her. My grandfather had spoken about legal matters constantly during his final years. Forgetting something this important simply wasn't believable. Within an hour, both of my parents were calling repeatedly. When I finally answered my father's call, he skipped the small talk completely. "Claire, if you found paperwork, we need you to bring it over today." I stayed calm. "I haven't finished reading everything yet," I replied. "Then don't waste time reading it," he answered. "Just bring it here so we can finish the sale." His urgency immediately confirmed my growing suspicions. I leaned back in my chair. "Grandpa specifically told me not to hand it to anyone until I fully understood why they wanted it." The line went completely silent. My father hadn't expected me to remember those exact instructions. After a few moments, he spoke again, this time sounding frustrated. "Claire, you're making this much harder than it needs to be." I answered quietly, "No, I'm making sure I understand what Grandpa wanted." That afternoon, both of my parents unexpectedly showed up outside my apartment building. They hadn't asked permission to visit. They simply appeared at my door with forced smiles and determined expressions. As soon as we sat down in my living room, my mother looked directly at me. "We know you have the missing document," she said. There was no point pretending anymore. They had connected the pieces. "I do have paperwork Grandpa trusted me with," I admitted. "But I haven't decided what I'm doing with it." My father immediately shook his head. "There isn't anything to decide. That land has already been sold." I calmly reached for the envelope but kept it firmly in my hands instead of passing it across the table. According to the buyer, the sale isn't complete. My father looked away for a brief moment before answering. "That's only because this document is missing," he admitted. "Exactly," I replied, "which means the property hasn't legally changed hands yet." Neither of them argued because they knew I was right. My mother softened her voice. "Claire, we need this money." I looked at her carefully. "Then why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning? Why did I have to hear everything from the buyer instead of my own parents?" Neither of them answered immediately. My father finally spoke. "We thought if you knew everything, you'd refuse." His honesty surprised me, but it also confirmed the one thing I had feared most. They had hidden the truth because they already knew what my answer would be. I slowly placed the envelope back on the table without opening it. Then you made the decision for me before I even had the chance. My words filled the room with an uncomfortable silence. After several long seconds, my father stood up. You're risking the family's future over one piece of paper. I looked up at him calmly. No. I'm protecting the responsibility Grandpa trusted me with. My mother tried one last time. Please, just let us finish this. I gently shook my head. Not until I know exactly what these papers say and exactly why Grandpa wanted me to keep them. Realizing they couldn't convince me, my parents finally left my apartment. The moment the door closed behind them, I locked it and returned the envelope to the fireproof box. Their desperation had only strengthened my decision to move carefully. The following morning, I called the attorney who had handled my grandfather's estate years earlier. I explained that I had found important legal documents and wanted someone independent to review every page before I made any decisions. The attorney listened quietly before asking me to bring everything to his office. As I gathered the envelope and prepared to leave, I had no idea that my grandfather's attorney was about to uncover something hidden deep inside the original estate records, something that would completely change the entire case and prove my parents had ignored one of my grandfather's most important final instructions. I arrived at my grandfather's attorney's office, carrying the brown envelope, as carefully as if it were made of glass. The building looked exactly as I remembered from years earlier, quiet and professional. Walking through those familiar doors brought back memories of sitting beside my grandfather, while he patiently reviewed documents I never thought I would need to understand. The attorney greeted me warmly and invited me into his office. He remembered my grandfather well and immediately recognized the envelope resting in my hands. His expression changed the moment he saw my grandfather's handwriting across the front. I haven't seen this in years, he said quietly. I carefully placed it on his desk. My grandfather asked me to keep it safe, I explained. Now I need to know exactly why. He opened the envelope with great care and began reviewing every page one by one. Several minutes passed without a single word. Occasionally he adjusted his glasses, compared one document with another, and made notes on a legal pad beside him. Finally, he looked up at me with a serious expression. Claire, he said calmly, your grandfather planned this very carefully. My heart immediately began racing. What do you mean? I asked. Instead of answering immediately, he unlocked a filing cabinet behind his desk and removed the original estate records. He placed them beside the papers I had brought and began comparing signatures, dates, and legal references. As he turned another page, he stopped suddenly. His finger rested on one paragraph while he silently read it again. There it is, he murmured almost to himself. I leaned forward. What did you find? He carefully turned the file toward me and pointed to a section my grandfather had personally signed years earlier. The language was straightforward but unmistakable. It clearly stated that ownership of the property could never be legally transferred without my written approval once I reached the age of 30. Until then, every decision involving the land was protected by that condition. I read the paragraph twice to make sure I understood it correctly. So my parents couldn't legally sell the property on their own? I asked. The attorney slowly shook his head. Not after your 30th birthday, he replied. Your grandfather specifically added this condition to prevent anyone else from making that decision for you. His words explained everything. I suddenly remembered how confident my parents had sounded when they claimed everything had already been handled. They either hadn't understood this condition or had hoped nobody would ever discover it. The attorney continued reviewing the file before speaking again. This missing document isn't simply another form. It's the document that activates your authority under the estate agreement. I looked down at the papers in disbelief. So without my approval, I asked, the sale cannot legally happen? He answered without hesitation. Correct. Your written consent is a legal requirement, not an optional step. For the first time since arriving at the property, I felt completely certain I wasn't imagining things. My grandfather hadn't left confusion behind. He had left clear instructions that were simply ignored. The attorney leaned back in his chair. "Did your parents know about this condition?" I thought carefully before answering. "I honestly don't know, but they definitely knew they needed this document." He slowly nodded. "Whether they understood every legal detail or not, they proceeded without obtaining your approval. That's a serious problem." His calm tone somehow made the situation feel even more significant. Later that afternoon, the attorney contacted Daniel, the buyer, and requested a formal meeting. Daniel agreed almost immediately. Within hours, everyone involved understood that the sale could not continue until the estate documents were fully reviewed. When my parents learned the attorney had become involved, my phone started ringing again. This time, I let every call go to voicemail. I had spent enough time listening to explanations without evidence. Now the documents could speak for themselves. The following day, I finally listened to one voicemail from my father. His confidence had disappeared. Instead of demanding the paperwork, he asked me to, "Please think about what was best for everyone." It was the first time he sounded uncertain. I quietly put my phone away without responding. I wasn't refusing to talk forever. I simply believed the truth deserved to come before emotions. For too long, those two things had been reversed. A few days later, everyone gathered in the attorney's conference room. My parents sat across the table from me, while Daniel quietly reviewed the paperwork. Nobody looked comfortable. The atmosphere was polite but tense. The attorney calmly explained every legal condition my grandfather had included in his estate plan. As he reached the section requiring my written approval, the room became completely silent. Daniel slowly closed his folder and looked toward my parents. "I wasn't informed about this condition," he said professionally. His disappointment was obvious, but he remained respectful throughout the discussion. My parents struggled to explain themselves, but every answer led back to the same unavoidable fact. The estate had always required my consent after I turned 30, and that consent had never been requested. As the meeting came to an end, I realized something important. The decision about the property's future now belonged exactly where my grandfather had always intended, with me. The only question left was whether I would ever agree to complete the sale, and that answer would depend entirely on whether every one of my grandfather's final instructions was respected exactly as he had written them. When the meeting ended, everyone left the conference room with more questions than answers. I stayed behind for a few minutes, quietly organizing the documents back into my grandfather's envelope. For the first time since this entire situation began, I wasn't reacting to someone else's decisions. The next move belonged to me. Before leaving the office, I asked my grandfather's attorney one final question. "If I decide not to sign anything today, what happens?" He answered calmly. "Nothing moves forward. The property remains exactly where your grandfather intended until you make an informed decision." His answer gave me peace. Nobody could pressure me anymore. The law protected the choice my grandfather had trusted me to make, and I intended to honor that responsibility instead of rushing toward the easiest solution. That evening, my parents asked if we could meet somewhere neutral. After thinking about it, I agreed. We chose a small coffee shop halfway between my apartment and their house. I wanted a calm conversation, not another argument. When I arrived, they were already waiting. My mother looked exhausted, and my father seemed quieter than I had ever seen him. Neither of them immediately mentioned the property. Instead, we sat in silence until our drinks arrived. Finally, my father spoke. "Claire, we don't want this to end in court." His voice lacked the confidence he had shown weeks earlier. I nodded slowly. "Neither do I." He leaned forward. "Then what do you want?" I looked at both of them before answering. I had spent several days thinking carefully about that exact question. "I'll consider signing the paperwork," I said calmly, "but only under one condition." Both of them immediately looked up. My mother asked softly, "What condition?" I reached into my bag and placed my grandfather's estate documents on the table. Every single instruction Grandpa left behind must be followed exactly as written, not the convenient parts. All of them. My father frowned slightly. That's all? I nodded. Yes. If Grandpa trusted me to protect his wishes, then I'm going to protect every one of them. For a moment, neither of them answered. They quietly looked through copies of the documents the attorney had prepared. The silence stretched longer than I expected. Eventually, my father shook his head. Some of those conditions make this sale much more complicated, I answered honestly. Complicated isn't the same as impossible. My mother gently closed the folder. Claire, we've already made financial plans based on this sale. I looked at her with sympathy, but remained firm. I understand that. But those plans were made without asking the one person Grandpa legally placed in charge. She lowered her eyes. Deep down, I think she knew I was right. They had acted first and expected my agreement later. That approach had created every problem we were now trying to solve. The meeting ended without any agreement. My parents weren't ready to accept every condition my grandfather had written. I wasn't willing to ignore them. We politely said goodbye and left separately. Over the next week, I heard nothing from either of them. The silence felt strange after weeks of constant phone calls and urgent messages. Part of me wondered whether they had decided to abandon the sale altogether. Then one afternoon, my grandfather's attorney called. Claire, he said, your parents have contacted me. I waited quietly for him to continue. They've asked for a complete review of every estate condition. They want to know exactly what your grandfather required before the property can legally be transferred. I couldn't help smiling slightly. What changed? I asked. The attorney answered simply. Reality. They now understand there isn't another path forward. Financial pressure had done what arguments never could. My parents had finally accepted that ignoring my grandfather's instructions was no longer an option. If they wanted the sale to happen, they would have to respect every condition they had previously overlooked. Over the following days, the attorney carefully reviewed each requirement with everyone involved, including Daniel, the buyer. To his credit, Daniel remained patient throughout the process. He repeatedly said he wanted everything completed properly, even if it meant waiting longer. That professionalism reassured me. Unlike the conflict within my family, the buyer wasn't trying to rush anyone. He simply wanted a legal and honest transaction. I respected that. Several days later, my parents requested one final meeting before any documents were signed. They said there was something important they needed to tell me in person, something they should have revealed long before the property was ever placed on the market. Curious, but cautious, I agreed to meet them once again at the attorney's office. I had no idea that the conversation waiting for me would have nothing to do with contracts or signatures. Instead, it would reveal a secret my parents had hidden for years. Letters my grandfather had personally written to me, but that I had never been allowed to see. When I arrived at the attorney's office, my parents were already sitting quietly in the conference room. The tension felt different this time. There were no folders spread across the table and no discussion about contracts. Instead, a small wooden box rested in front of my mother. I had never seen it before. As I took my seat, nobody spoke for several seconds. My father finally broke the silence. Before we talk about the property, he said quietly, there's something we should have told you a long time ago. His voice carried more regret than confidence. I looked at the wooden box. What's inside? I asked. My mother gently placed her hand on the lid before answering. Letters, she whispered. Letters your grandfather wrote for you during the last year of his life. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood her. Letters? I repeated. Why have I never seen them? My parents exchanged a guilty glance before my father answered. Because we kept them. His words hung heavily in the room. I stared at him, unable to believe what I had just heard. You kept my grandfather's letters from me? My mother lowered her eyes. Yes. Her voice was barely above a whisper. We told ourselves we'd give them to you later. Then everything became more complicated, and we never did. I felt a wave of disappointment that was even stronger than the anger I had experienced over the property. My grandfather had taken the time to write to me, and those words had been hidden for years. Why? I asked quietly. Why would you do that? My father slowly took a deep breath before answering, because we were afraid. He looked directly at me for the first time. We believed those letters would convince you never to sell the land. We thought if you read them, you'd reject every plan we had. His honesty left the room completely silent. They hadn't hidden the letters by accident. They had made a deliberate choice because they feared my grandfather's words would carry more weight than theirs. I looked down at the wooden box again. So while you were asking me to trust you, you were hiding the one thing Grandpa wanted me to read. Neither of them tried to argue. My mother quietly nodded. It was wrong, she admitted. Every day we kept them, it became harder to tell you the truth. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't ask for sympathy. The attorney gently slid the box toward me. These belong to you, he said softly. They always did. I rested my hands on the lid without opening it immediately. My emotions were impossible to sort through all at once. Part of me wanted answers. Another part simply wanted to hear my grandfather's voice again through his own words. I slowly lifted the lid. Inside were several neatly folded envelopes, each dated in my grandfather's familiar handwriting. Seeing his writing again immediately brought back memories of afternoons spent together on the old porch. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the first letter. I looked toward my parents one final time before opening it. Neither of them said a word. They knew this moment belonged to me. I unfolded the paper carefully. The very first line made my eyes fill with tears before I'd even finished reading. My dear Claire, it began, if you're holding this letter, it means life has probably become more complicated than either of us hoped. I smiled through my emotions because those words sounded exactly like him. Calm, thoughtful, never dramatic. As I continued reading, he didn't mention lawyers or money. Instead, he wrote about kindness, patience, and making decisions I could live with years later. Every sentence felt personal, as though he knew exactly when I would need his guidance. The second letter explained why he had trusted me with the final document instead of anyone else. He wrote that real responsibility wasn't about ownership. It was about protecting the freedom to choose wisely without being pressured by other people. I slowly looked up from the page. Everything my parents had hidden suddenly made sense. They hadn't feared the legal paperwork nearly as much as they had feared these letters. My grandfather's words directly challenged the very pressure they had been placing on me. My father quietly cleared his throat. "We're sorry," he said. "We thought we were protecting the family." I gently shook my head. "No," I answered softly. "You were protecting a decision you had already made." Neither of them disagreed because they knew it was true. I gathered the letters carefully and placed them back inside the wooden box. There were still several left to read, and I wanted to give each one the time and respect it deserved. As I left the attorney's office carrying the box in my hands, I realized something important. My grandfather hadn't written those letters to tell me what decision to make. He had written them to remind me that the decision had always belonged to me alone. I had no idea that the remaining letters were about to reveal the true reason he left me the property, and why the land itself had never been the greatest inheritance he intended to give me. That evening, I carried the wooden box home as carefully as I had once carried the envelope containing the final document. I placed it on my dining table, made a cup of tea, and sat quietly for several minutes before opening it again. I wanted to read every letter without distractions, because I knew each one contained something my grandfather had wanted me to hear in his own words. I picked up the next envelope and unfolded the pages slowly. His handwriting was as neat and familiar as ever. Reading it almost felt like hearing his voice sitting across from me. For a moment, I forgot he was gone. The letter didn't begin with legal advice or instructions about money. Instead, he wrote about the afternoons we spent walking across the property together. He reminded me how I always asked questions about every tree, every fence, and every old building on the land. I smiled without realizing it. He wrote that the property had given our family many opportunities over the years, but it had never been the most valuable thing he owned. That sentence immediately caught my attention. I leaned closer and continued reading carefully. "The land is only soil," he wrote. "Its value changes with time. Character does not." I paused for a moment, letting those words settle in my mind. They sounded simple, but they carried more wisdom than any legal document ever could. The following letter explained why he had trusted me instead of making the decision himself before he passed away. He admitted he could have sold the property while he was still alive if money had been his priority. Instead, he deliberately chose not to. "I wanted you to have something far more important than land," he wrote. "I wanted you to have the freedom to make the decision yourself." I slowly lowered the page and looked out my apartment window. At that moment, I finally understood what my parents had never realized. They believed the inheritance was the property itself. My grandfather believed the inheritance was the responsibility to choose honestly, without being controlled by anyone else. The next letter made that lesson even clearer. He wrote, "If one day selling the land becomes the right decision, don't let guilt stop you. If keeping it becomes the right decision, don't let pressure change your mind. Either choice can be honorable if it is truly yours." I read that paragraph several times. Suddenly, months of conflict began making sense. The argument had never really been about real estate. It had been about whether my choice would remain my own. I remembered the conversations with my parents, the hidden paperwork, the missing letters, and every attempt to convince me before I knew the full truth. None of those actions respected the freedom my grandfather had intentionally protected. As I continued reading, I found one final letter near the bottom of the box. It was shorter than the others, but perhaps the most meaningful. He thanked me for always listening to him with kindness, even when we disagreed. Then he wrote one sentence that stayed with me long after I finished reading. "Trust is the only inheritance that grows when you protect it." I quietly folded the letter and smiled through tears. That single sentence explained every decision he had made during the final years of his life. The next morning, I called my grandfather's attorney and asked to meet again. When we sat down in his office, I placed the letters beside the estate documents. "I've made my decision," I told him calmly. He didn't ask what it was. Instead, he simply waited for me to explain it in my own words. "I understand now that Grandpa never wanted anyone to pressure me toward keeping the land or selling it," I said. "He wanted the decision to belong to me." The attorney smiled gently and nodded. "That's exactly how I always interpreted his wishes," he replied. Hearing someone else confirm what I had discovered through the letters gave me even greater confidence. I left his office feeling lighter than I had in months. The fear, confusion, and anger that had surrounded the property were finally beginning to disappear. My decision would no longer be based on guilt, pressure, or family expectations. Later that afternoon, I called Daniel, the buyer, and asked if he would be willing to wait a little longer while everything was finalized, according to my grandfather's instructions. Without hesitation, he agreed. His patience reminded me that not everyone involved in this situation had acted dishonestly. Some people simply wanted the process completed fairly. That made my next decision much easier. I contacted my parents and told them I was ready to move forward, but only in the way my grandfather had intended from the beginning. There would be no shortcuts, no hidden information, and no decisions made behind anyone's back. As I ended the call, I realized something that changed the way I looked at the entire inheritance. My grandfather hadn't measured my future by acres of land or the size of a bank account. He had measured it by whether I would protect my own judgment when it mattered most. For the first time since strangers began measuring the property, I no longer saw the land as the greatest gift my grandfather had left me. His greatest gift had been his complete trust that I would choose wisely when everyone else wanted to choose for me. Now, all that remained was to honor that trust by completing the sale on my own terms and making sure every one of his final wishes became a reality. A week later, everyone gathered once again at my grandfather's attorney's office. This meeting felt completely different from every previous one. The tension had been replaced by quiet patience. Every required document was organized neatly on the conference table, and every condition my grandfather had written had been carefully included. Before anyone discussed signatures, I asked the attorney to read my grandfather's final instructions aloud one more time. I wanted everyone in the room to hear the words exactly as he had written them. No assumptions, no shortcuts, no missing pages. The attorney slowly read each condition while everyone listened in complete silence. My parents never interrupted. Daniel quietly followed along with his own copy. Every sentence reminded me why my grandfather had trusted written truth more than spoken promises. When the reading ended, the attorney looked at me. "Claire," he said calmly, "the decision is entirely yours." Hearing those words no longer felt frightening. Instead, they felt like the responsibility my grandfather had prepared me to carry. I took a slow breath and looked around the room. "I've made my decision," I said. "I will approve the sale." My parents both looked relieved, but before either of them spoke, I gently raised my hand. "There is one thing I want everyone to understand," I continued. "I'm not signing because anyone pressured me. I'm signing because I've read Grandpa's letters, reviewed every document, and reached this decision myself." Daniel nodded respectfully. "That's exactly how it should be," he said. His response reassured me that he understood the importance of the moment. My father looked at me quietly. "Thank you," he said. His words sounded sincere, but I could also hear the regret behind them. He understood how differently everything could have unfolded if honesty had come first. I signed the approval documents carefully, reading every page before writing my name. The attorney reviewed each signature before placing the papers into the official file. Only then did he announce that the legal requirements had finally been satisfied. For the first time since this process had begun, the sale could legally move forward exactly as my grandfather intended. Nothing had been skipped. Nothing had been hidden. Every instruction had been respected. After the paperwork was complete, my parents asked if we could speak privately outside the office. I agreed. We walked together into the quiet hallway, where sunlight streamed through the large windows overlooking the parking lot. My mother spoke first. "Claire, we owe you more than an apology." She looked genuinely emotional. "We spent so much time trying to control the outcome that we forgot to trust you." I listened without interrupting. Her words weren't perfect, but they sounded honest. My father nodded slowly. "Your grandfather trusted you because he believed you'd do the right thing. We should have trusted you too." It was the first time either of them openly admitted they had been wrong. I didn't respond immediately. Forgiveness wasn't something I wanted to offer simply because the paperwork was finished. It had to be genuine. Finally, I smiled softly. "I can't change what happened," I said. "None of us can. But we can choose what happens next." Both of them quietly nodded. A few days later, the property officially transferred to Daniel. The closing process happened smoothly, because every legal requirement had finally been completed correctly. Watching the final paperwork leave the attorney's office felt surprisingly peaceful instead of painful. When the funds were distributed according to my grandfather's estate plan, everything happened exactly as he had intended years earlier. There were no last-minute arguments and no unexpected surprises. The process that had once seemed impossible ended with clarity. A few weeks later, I returned to the property one final time before ownership officially changed hands. I walked slowly across the familiar fields where my grandfather and I had spent countless afternoons together. The old oak tree still stood exactly where it always had. I placed my hand against its rough bark and quietly thanked my grandfather for believing in me long before I believed in myself. As I stood there, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't leaving behind my inheritance. I was carrying it with me. The land had been only one part of his gift. His trust, his wisdom, and his faith in my judgment would remain with me forever. Before leaving, I opened the wooden box one last time and reread the final letter. This time, I smiled instead of crying. His words no longer felt like instructions. They felt like encouragement. I carefully closed the box and looked across the property one last time before walking back to my car. The wind moved gently through the trees, just as it had when my grandfather used to stand beside me explaining why patience always mattered more than rushing toward easy answers. As I drove away, I wasn't thinking about the money from the sale. I was thinking about the promise I had silently made to him. No matter where life took me, I would never again allow fear, pressure, or secrecy to decide my future. A few days after the closing, the attorney called one final time. His voice carried a quiet warmth as he said there was one last item from my grandfather's estate waiting for me. It wasn't money, property, or another legal document. According to the note attached to it, my grandfather had saved it until every lesson was finally complete.